Welcome to our second preview of the San Francisco opera season. Tonight, our speaker is Laura Prichard, who studied at Yale, Emory, and the University of Illinois. And right now she is teaching at both Harvard and Bunker Hill. She holds master's and doctoral degrees in choral conducting, library science, musicology, and education. She lectures regularly for the San Francisco and Chicago symphonies and opera companies in Boston and in San Francisco since 1997. In fact, many of you probably recognize her for giving those pre-opera talks and symphony talks in San Francisco. She and her husband, and she was the assistant conductor of the San Francisco Symphony Chorus under Vance George for a few years. And she and her husband, Michael, sing with the Boston and San Francisco Symphony Choruses. And she will be back for 2 San Francisco Symphony Choruses in opera in October, including Beethoven's Ninth. Her 25 continuous years of college teaching have focused on the interdisciplinary cultural analysis of music, dance, and art history. She has many publications throughout the world and in different encyclopedias. And she was a finalist for the 2015 Pauline Alderman Award for Outstanding Writing on Women in Music, and another award for writing on contemporary musical theater. And it's not only is she has this wonderful background, but she's just a warm, lovely, engaging person. I'm sure you're going to enjoy tonight's preview. And with that, I would like to introduce Laura Prichard for the revolution of Steve Jobs. Welcome, Laura.
Hello, nice to see everyone. Thank you very much, Peggy, for that wonderful introduction. And after I am done with my presentation, we will invite John Morris to lead a Q&A. So if anyone has questions as I'm going along, in the bottom of the window for the Zoom webinar, there is a button that says Q&A, and that's our preferred place that you write comments, and then John will go through those. There are a few people joining us who worked at Apple, so you would be able to ask some more technical and historical questions about the company. And so I'm going to go ahead and begin by sharing my screen. So let's see. First, we need to share the screen, and you should see a white screen with a lot of Apple products on it. An evolution from the Macintosh through some more modern looking screens. And I wanted to start by sharing with you part of the San Francisco Opera's webpage to honor the people who have brought us this production. The entire opera, the project itself was conceived by the composer, which is a little bit unusual for a modern opera. He was not commissioned to write this or charged with this subject in any way. He came up with the idea and went looking for a librettist and chose Mark Campbell. Mason has been living in the Bay Area for quite a while now. He went to UC Berkeley, and he's worked consistently since graduate school for the San Francisco Symphony, and also been a composer in residence in Chicago, and was the first composer in residence for the Kennedy Center. Mark Campbell is a librettist based in Greenwich Village in New York City, and since 2004, he's been concentrating on writing words for operas and concert works, and is now one of our leading American librettists. So you'll get to hear from both of them directly. I have some video of them speaking. Conductor Michael Christie might be new to you. He conducted the recording that was made of this opera, done by most of the performers in the Santa Fe Opera who premiered the work. And he led that recording, which won the Grammy for Best Opera Recording. So he'll be with us in San Francisco this week conducting. Director Kevin Newberry also was involved with the Santa Fe Opera premiere. Set designer Vida Tzikun, she is a Ukrainian Israeli American designer, and costume designer Paul Carey, and lighting designer Jaffe Vitamin. All of these folks were involved in the original Santa Fe production. And so you are seeing the original production as it was co-commissioned by Santa Fe Opera, San Francisco Opera. We were supposed to do it in 2020, Seattle Opera, and Indiana University's Jacobs School of Music. So those are the players, and we will, if you go to see the work live, there will be an after party every show in the basement, and it will have as its theme 1980. So that will take you back to the time of the founding of Apple. And if you can't attend in person, we have a button on the website, buy live stream, and almost 1 week from today, middle of next week, there is, if I click it, it should work. You can live stream, you can attend the performance from the comfort of your own home Wednesday, September 27th. So that is on our website. Okay, so then I prepared a slide deck, and let me begin. This has in it many excerpts from the opera. Some are recordings from Santa Fe, some are recordings from Seattle, and there are even a couple of recordings from Austin and Atlanta. So the work's been done a few times now. So the title of the work is The Revolution of Steve Jobs. This is the original production, as I mentioned, and I put my name there where I'm teaching, and I've been a member of the staff at San Francisco Opera since 1997, when I started giving pre-concert lectures live in person. What did I speak about? Britain's Peter Grimes at that point. And I have my email there if anyone wants to write me a more detailed question. It's just my name, laura@prichard.net. So in this image, you see in the bottom right-hand corner, a young, charismatic Steve Jobs. You see in the bottom center of this image, Steve Wozniak, brilliant engineer, who he worked with on many early projects. And in the top left corner, you see one of the first things that they developed together. Steve Wozniak created a thing called Blue Box. And the point of the Blue Box was to do phone phreaking, basically to get around Ma Bell. And Steve Jobs knew that there was a market for this and convinced Steve Wozniak to create these, to manufacture them themselves, and to sell them to Steve Wozniak's fellow college students at UC Berkeley. So it's one of their first business ventures together. So just while you're looking at this slide and marveling at their youth, I wanted to say a few general things about Steve Jobs' background. You may know that he was born in 1955, grew up mostly in the Bay Area. He attended college for basically a year at Reed College in Oregon, where some of the classes he found most interesting were things like calligraphy, which would later inspire him to think about colors that could be offered on a computer screen, different fonts that could be offered on a computer screen, and even ways of displaying fonts to make the fonts look more like handwritten fonts, proportionally allowing the letters to be different sizes instead of one character per space on the computer. He went on to have a wide variety of short-term jobs and to work his way through Silicon Valley's sort of emerging tech market. And many of those jobs were actually kind of gotten for him by Steve Wozniak. It was not uncommon for him to go to an interview and talk a good game and present innovative ideas, and to then show a device that very often Steve Wozniak had been the inventor of, the maker of. And so when we talk about the brilliance of Steve Jobs, we talk about his ability to inspire others and his ability to think about a technology that either was already just existing or was on the verge of being fully fleshed out, and to see a future market for it and see an application for it. And one thing my husband said to me today about him, my husband worked at Apple for a while. He said one thing he really admired about him was his ability as an editor. And now today, you know, we think of the composer as an exalted figure and the librettist as an exalted figure, and an editor maybe less so. But if you think of an editor in terms of film, without a good actually female editor, Jaws would just be a 50-hour movie of people floating in a boat with a bad special effect. But with a good editor, it's a highly organized and tense, dramatic production. And so he really had that kind of ear and that kind of eye. He could look at a device and say, it's almost there. Here's what I want it to be. Invent something to make my vision possible. So this is Mason Bates, now Bay Area composer. Let me tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll listen to his music and hear a little bit of his own words. Mason Wesley Bates, born in 1977 in Philadelphia. He was raised in Virginia on a farm and eventually came to New York. He studied at Columbia and Juilliard. They have a combined program, and he got a BA in music and a master's degree in composition. He went on to UC Berkeley and was actually at UC Berkeley for 4 or 5 years, and in the middle of it won the Rome Prize, which enabled him to study composition in Rome. And then he graduated from UC Berkeley with a PhD in composition in 2008, won the Guggenheim in the same year, and then he's been working for symphony orchestras since then. His first collaboration with San Francisco Symphony was with Michael Tilson Thomas in 2009. I gave the pre-concert lecture for that. And he's actually been on the composition faculty at San Francisco Conservatory since 2014. I mentioned before, he has had a series of composer in residence positions. I worked with him in San Francisco. I worked with him at Chicago Symphony, and he's the very first composer in residence to work with the Kennedy Center as well. In 2017, San Francisco Symphony recorded some of his music and won a Grammy for Best Orchestral Performance. And now he is both a DJ and techno artist. You see him with his headphones on in the bottom left. And he's also a prize-winning symphonic composer. So let's hear a little bit of his music. This is a recording of Seattle playing some of the instrumental music from this opera. This is the music that Bates describes as his theme of inspiration, the sound of Steve Jobs' mind at work. Okay, so I'm going to edit a bit as I go to save time.
Steve Jobs' soul, really beautifully.
Okay. I told you a little bit about Steve Jobs' background, and although he was not technically the engineer who invented some of these devices, he was the idea man. He was the inspiration. He was the guiding force that called for the development of these items. So I just wanted to mention kind of 4 main products from Apple, and in the opera, you'll hear a series of many scenes, and some of those scenes deal directly with the introduction of some of these products. So I wanted to say just a few words about sort of the incredible creativity and the I read in Business Insider that Steve Wozniak, the engineer who developed several early products with Steve Jobs, Wozniak was credited with a staggering burst of technical invention, really one of the most incredibly creative single people to have these leaps forward in high-tech history. And that wouldn't have been possible. It wouldn't have been brought to the public. And it wouldn't have been developed into a product that we can all afford if it weren't for Steve Jobs and that close partnership. So really a visionary, an idea man. The Apple II there in the corner, you might recognize that from 1977. That's really the first practical personal computer to be marketed. Across to the right with the red background, that's the 1984 Macintosh, one of the first computers with a built-in monitor. And you see that mouse in front of him that's now very recognizable. That was actually originally developed at Xerox PARC, but adapted and kind of recrafted and repackaged to be part of Macintosh when it was launched. In the middle there, sort of the heart of the slide, is the iMac from 1998. This was something that my husband kind of worked on parts of and worked with you can see behind me, there's an iBook related to that product. And then I wanted to hold up the power supply, a circular power supply, and the back of it also is circular. And this idea of a circle and of the rounded corners, radiused corners, my husband tells me, the rounded edges of things, slightly different design sense, was very innovative. Now, iMac was the first to have USB ports, which we now use all the time, instead of all the old different serial ports and the connections for keyboards and things. And that I put in the heart on purpose because he worked at Apple, he developed the company and then left the company and helped to develop Next computers, which I went to grad school at University of Illinois, and we had a huge lab of Next computers. And also he gave a lot of the original seed money for the company that became Pixar. So had a big influence in visual design as well. So this iMac is one of the first kind of new products that mark his triumphal return to Apple and really kind of saving the company financially. In the bottom left corner, you'll see the iPhone. That's the very first one. I have a little paper version of it that I use. And it is a scene that makes up an important early part, an early aria in the opera. So I wanted to let you hear a little bit of Steve Jobs. He had a distinctive manner of speech. He's one of the first CEOs to do these large public presentations, and with his own choice of dress, his own personal style, to really kind of invent this type of large scale public keynote. You'll notice all the black background, a focus on the images, very consistent fashion sense, and a very distinctive way of speaking. So I wanted to let you hear just 1 minute of this early presentation, well, not early in the history of the company, but early in the history of the iPhone and the current products. And you'll see that referenced in the opera as well. So here's Steve himself in 2007. Okay. Just 1 minute of him.
Great idea 6 months from now. You can't run around and add a button to these things. They're already shipped. So what do? It doesn't work because the buttons and the controls can't change. They can't change for each application, and they can't change down the road if you think of another great idea you want to add to this product. Well, how do you solve this? It turns out we have solved it. We solved it in computers 20 years ago. We solved it with a bitmap screen that could display anything we want, put any user interface up, and a pointing device. We solved it with the mouse, right? We solved this problem. So how are we going to take this to a mobile device? Well, what we're going to do is get rid of all these buttons and just make a giant screen. A giant screen. Now, how are we going to communicate this? We don't want to carry around a mouse, right? So what are we going to do? Oh, a stylus, right? We're going to use a stylus. No. No. Who wants a stylus? You have to get them and put them away and you lose them. Yuck. Nobody wants a stylus. So let's not.
So that gives you a sense of the way that he presented his incredible sort of gift at marketing and presentation. Here's the old way of doing things. Here are the things that we're thinking might be possible in the future. Here is our solution for you. And you can hear the crowd react to that as he goes along. So let's see it in opera form. I put Steve notes instead of keynotes. That was something a lot of us used to call them. So let's hear 2 excerpts from the opera relating to these keynotes, and then a duet that is set in 1976 when Steve Wozniak, young engineer, has just started at UC Berkeley, and Steve Jobs are meeting together to talk about that very first image I showed you, the little blue box that Steve Wozniak is presenting and saying, look what I made. And Steve Jobs sees a future for it, sees a way that it could be sold and it could lead to the development of future things. So first we'll listen to 2 short excerpts, about 2 minutes, from the beginning of the opera from scenes taken from these keynotes or Steve notes.
Recall I once said, never trust a computer. You can lift. Not now today, I say. Never trust one you can fit in your pocket. And here you have it, right here, right now. Nestled in my pocket, cradled in my hand. Today, right now.
Another similar scene.
Entertainment, information, illumination, connection, interaction, navigation, communication, inspiration, comprehension, not to mention communication. One device does it all in one hand. Tap in the news. Tap Senate date. Tap in the flight. Tap stay in touch. Tap stay in shape. Tap conference. Tap specialist. Tap map a road. Tap pay a bill. Tap plan a day. Tap clear a day. Tap try an app. Tap scrap an app. It's a buff. You're the boss. You're your boss. Share the game, play a game, send a card, mend the heart. Buy a time, live some time, order time. Miss your kids, miss your wife, miss your home, miss your life.
Okay, so that's kind of the typical sound. It's very much organized by Mason Bates. It's meant to show his energy, his inspiration, and then we step away from his career working with engineers and developing products and have a kind of a deep dive into his personal life. And there have been actually several really great memoirs written by people he knew that give us a lot of detail about his personal life and his relationships and his personal philosophy. For example, Steve Wozniak wrote, with the help of an author, a book called IWOZ, IWOZ, in 2007, and talked about their partnership. His wife wrote a memoir in 2013, 2 years after his death, called The Bite in the Apple. And his first daughter, not his wife, his high school girlfriend, Chris-Ann Brennan, wrote a book called The Bite in the Apple. And then her daughter, their daughter together, Lisa, wrote a book called Small Fry in 2018. So we actually have a lot of different perspectives on his personal life. And it's wonderful in this opera to get to hear both his wife, Laureen Powell, and his high school girlfriend, Chris-Ann Brennan, as leading characters. So here's just a little bit of the kind of interaction that they have. And a lot of it is in recitative style, lightly sung speech.
Promise, just need a walk to clear my head.
Okay, so one thing you may have noticed from that, contrasting with the earlier music, is that it's a more traditional string orchestra sound with classical woodwinds. And I want to let you hear then a contrasting type of music. This is more sort of jazz and blues oriented, it's kind of swinging music. And this is a duet set in their kind of early collegiate year of 1976. The characters are not dressed or costumed as though they were 19. They're dressed in costume kind of consistently throughout. But in this moment where Steve Wozniak is presenting his blue box to Steve Jobs, who says, I see a future for this device. I see a future for this kind of device. They are singing that they are going to defeat Ma Bell. Basically, they're going to do phone freaking with it. They're going to go around the corporate system. So Bell Telephone won't be able to get money from their phone calls. And they make a long list of authors and musicians, including Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas, that inspired them in their college years. So this is a little bit of the character of Steve Wozniak on your left and the character of Steve Jobs singing in Steve Jobs' father's garage about the blue box.
Down Marble was just screwed over. Marble was just rotten. Money-sucking, monolithic, monopolistic, autocratic knees. Marble was just brought to her knees. Marble was just brought to her knees. That's one for the common people, that's one for Abby Hoffman, that's one for Cesar Chavez, that's one for the troublemakers, rebel freaking sinners who keep this planet spinning, for Dylan, for Bob Dylan, and Thomas, Bob and Thomas, rebels, freaks, reformers who keep this planet spinning. Only goes to show, all you ever need to take down the corporate Goliath, take down the Wall Street behemoths, take down the corporate Goliaths, take down the Wall Street behemoths. Is a decent slingshot, decent slingshot.
So they're saying all you need to take down a corporate Goliath is a decent slingshot. Okay, so that's a nice comic scene. I mentioned that Mason Bates has composed a lot of music for symphony orchestra, and he actually has even made a 10-minute version of his favorite music from the opera, which is called Rhapsody of Steve Jobs. So I want to go out of my slideshow for just a second and let you hear just a few words by him when he was describing his conception of the opera. And this is a video owned by the Philadelphia Orchestra. The Philadelphia Orchestra is the orchestra that commissioned his Rhapsody. So this is Mason Bates's his own webpage. You can see it says masonbates.com. He has program notes of all of his works. He has videos and files that you can listen to them. And on the page describing his new Rhapsody of Steve Jobs is a video. And I just wanted you to hear just a few seconds of it where he talks about why would you choose Steve Jobs as a subject.
One of the things that's so interesting to me is people's response to the idea of Steve Jobs as the subject of an opera. At the time when I conceived of it, he seemed like the perfect subject, almost so perfect that I thought somebody else was going to write an opera before I finished mine. The reason his life is the stuff of opera is that it's filled with passion, obsession, betrayal, love, and of course his tragically untimely death.
Now let's hear a little bit more music and hear from more of the collaborators. I wanted to address the idea of this as an appropriate subject for opera, which he brings up. From its beginnings, we have characters in opera like Orpheus. Over on the left, you have an image from several operas around 1600, the birth of opera over 400 years ago. And we find that early operas usually had subjects that were talking about power, and especially power over our emotions and power over our imagination. Sometimes the power would be controlled through music, and that character on the left, Orpheus, certainly is a famous mythological person that can control your emotions and command your attention through his beautiful music. But early operas also talk a lot about new technologies and new ideas and ways that power can be held by especially a powerful male figure. In the right side of this slide, you have Prince. And Prince was not someone who was as interested in live theater, but curated a lot of musical groups and developed musical groups and shaped popular music of his time. He was well known as a musician, but also as someone who helped to produce and inspire films about music. For example, there's a film, Purple Rain, and he absolutely used as much technology as he could and pushed music toward new sounds through his use of technology. And so we find both of these elements, sort of the beginning of staged dramatic music in Europe around 1600, and this recent interest in using popular music and popular music techniques in staged presentations of music. We find both of these in this new opera. I wanted to mention one particular person in the history of opera. I don't know if you recognize him on the left. That is the young teenage Louis XIV. And he is a person who, although he was not a composer, he was not the creator of operas, he, more than any person in the history of opera, had an outsized influence on it. And it's a role relating to opera that's very much like Steve Jobs' role in the high-tech world. Opera and dance in France was developing in the 16 and 1700s. And some operas had speech and some operas had sung speech, like you just heard in the Steve Jobs opera. And they preferred bowed strings, which you heard still in the Revolution of Steve Jobs, plucked lutes, and you'll find when Steve Jobs is on stage, you'll hear electric guitar, sometimes representing his character, and they had keyboards. And the keyboards of the time looked like this: 1 and 2 and 3 manual harpsichords. The keyboards of our time include piano, electric synthesizers, and computer keyboards, all of which were used to make this opera. In the time of Louis XIV, there was a form of music called ballet de cour, and operas were developing, and opera comique were developing to have either fully sung or partly sung with speech evenings of entertainment. And so Louis XIV felt very strongly that he wanted to develop opera in a new direction. He wanted to appear alone on stage with an all black background with light only on him. He wanted to be able to present whole scenes by himself. And here he is dressed as the sun in a gold costume. And actually right before you see this, in the production that he first appeared in as a teenager, he actually rises up through the floor on some very noisy machinery and appears, and then there are light effects using mirrors and candles, special devices that had to be created to create the effect that he wanted. So he's controlling all aspects of the performance. He, as I said, didn't compose operas, but he brought from Italy a young man named Giovanni Battista Lully, and brought him to France, and together they developed French opera with 3 goals in mind. And these goals are not only relevant to Baroque opera, but they're relevant to this current opera, Revolution of Steve Jobs. So I wanted to just mention those ideas. We have puissance, the idea that opera is the ideal vehicle to present in an artistic way people of great power, people of great influence, and ideas of great power and influence. If you think back to Orpheus and his lute moving the souls in the underworld to tears. In this case, we have in the Revolution of Steve Jobs, a person who is a visionary, who's leading us toward new goals that we didn't know, things we hadn't imagined yet. Secondarily, Louis XIV and Lully wanted opera to give plaisir. They wanted it to be pleasurable for all the senses, a joy to the ear and the eye, and create a feeling of delight and wonder. And that's something that I think Mason Bates's music is really ideally suited to, an idea of the sense of play and fun in this. And then the last of the 3 main goals of French opera was lumière, the idea of using technology, using light, using everything at your disposal to create a new exotic and sort of escapist world of opera that would draw you in to new places and new imagined universes. So in their time, they're playing with candles and mirrors. In our time, we're playing with projections, video screens, moving silent set pieces that would have astonished folks in the French Baroque. They had very, very noisy machinery, but the machinery was meant to be visible and an important part of the opera. So back to Mason Bates. I want to let you hear a little more of his comments about how he conceived of this work. Just about a minute. So this will start with the composer speaking, and then and they will actually show you the very first time any of this music was heard publicly, which was in San Francisco. Then there'll be a little excerpt of the librettist speaking about how they work together. That's Mark Campbell. And then it will conclude with a few more words from Mason Bates. This is about 1 minute of the composer and librettist speaking about their goals for the work.
What fascinates me about the story of Steve Jobs is that the man who miniaturized and simplified our human communication onto these sleek little devices had so many issues with the complication of human life. I've often looked to exotic forms to pull new sounds out of me, and particularly in an opera about a man who revolutionized communication. I think this can really be taken to its full kind of fruition, where every character has very distinct sound worlds, whether it be the inner world of Steve Jobs, which is Quicksilver, acoustic guitar picking, electronica, to the more oceanic lyrical harmonies of Laureen Powell Jobs, his wife, to the kind of diffuse electroacoustic sound world of Coboon, Steve Jobs' spiritual advisor. What happens when those worlds collide?
The libretto for Steve Jobs has a very nonlinear narrative. We create a story where he is confronting his own mortality, decides to look at a few places in his past.
Life is complicated, but this is a man who had this vision for simplifying that communication. And in that tension, I think will make for thrilling opera.
If
Okay. The design of the production has been lauded. It is, as I mentioned, the work of set designer Vita Zieken, and their projections throughout by Ben Piercy. The idea of what they're going to project on comes from the very earliest Italian operas. This is a typical Italian comic opera set. It's a typical Italian design, multiple doors for characters to come in and out, a lot left to your imagination, and a lot of blank and dark space. So you'll definitely see that throughout this 100-minute opera. Those elements are kind of the most traditional design elements, but instead of doors like you have here, you will see things that remind me of sort of the black monolith at first in the movie 2001. And sometimes those are boards for projections. Sometimes they are sort of doorways, and sometimes they become the actual products themselves. At one point, you saw them becoming the iPhones themselves. The contrasting kind of design, contrasting most highly with this sort of sparse, imagine the world yourself Italian design, is also present in this opera. So I want to show you an example of French opera. Opera production has evolved far beyond its original conception, where you basically don't need a set and you really didn't even need costumes. It has evolved to be less talking and more singing, so fully sung recitatives instead of spoken sections. It's evolved extravagant costumes and machinery, visible machinery, and in this case, you will see characters costumed as they appeared very often in real life, so not extravagant in that sense, but you will see the machinery, you will see the devices present. As opera developed, orchestras became bigger, but maybe more importantly than just bigger, they became more diverse. And it was a place that a lot of new instrument sounds were featured for the first time before people heard them on the concert stage. Band instruments evolved throughout the 1800s, and they were introduced as soloists in opera orchestras as new technology improved the sound of things, for example, like a simple wooden flute, to have it evolve to become full of keys and made of metal and easy to tune and keep in tune. A lot of those developments were heard in opera pits. And so in this orchestra, you will hear electronic sounds. You will hear sound effects from early computers. You will hear electronic plucked instruments like the electric guitar. And that's all part of the natural evolution of opera. Especially in France, they loved trapdoors. They loved to rebuild ships on the stage. They threw real water on people. They loved to always try to include groups of soloists singing in a chorus or actual separate choristers on stage, and especially machines. And you'll see some influence of all of that combined with that sparse early Italian design sense in this opera. References both to the most extreme, use as much technology and projection as possible, and the simplicity of the black backdrop. Mark Campbell, when he was developing the libretto, did a lot of research and found that there was a particular symbol that meant a lot to Steve Jobs. And so in the production, you'll see this symbol float around in the background of the projections, and you'll hear him sing about the importance of the circle. And this is a particular circle in Zen Buddhism, which he studied on a couple of different occasions, and a symbol, the enso circle, that he discussed with a man named Kobuncino, who became his spiritual advisor. And that person, in the form of kind of a spirit guide, appears in the opera as well. So here's just 1 minute on the importance of the enso, because that's something that guided Mark Campbell in his creation of the opera.
Symbol in the Zen school of thought. It's typically created with one uninterrupted stroke of the brush, although sometimes it can be painted with 2 strokes. Drawing an enso is a precise art that has to be done in one fluid stroke. The enso can be open or closed. Once drawn, the symbol can't be altered in any way. The enso symbol can be traced back to the 6th century, where it was first depicted as an out-of-shape circle. It was believed to represent the idea of immense space that has no need of anything and contains nothing that it needs. It is an indication of satisfaction with what one has. It is empty and yet full, with no beginning or end. The enso expresses the complex ideas of Zen Buddhism in a simple, minimalist stroke. A closed enso represents perfection, the universe, and enlightenment.
Okay, so let's hear from our librettist directly, and that would be Mark Campbell. He has not only written dozens of opera libretti and contributed texts to concert oratorios. I've been working with him for the last 3 years on a new project that the New York Philharmonic will give the American premiere of this season on Leap Year Day. But also he has on his own created a prize to encourage American writers to focus on opera writing. So it's called the Campbell Opera Librettist Prize. He gives $7,000 to one candidate per year, funded by him, and he's been a librettist mainly focused on writing this kind of text since 2004. It's our first American award to specifically recognize the opera librettist. And he's in San Francisco right now this week for the local premiere of the work. So let's hear from him directly. And we'll save a little bit of time, 32. And I've interspersed this with recordings made at Seattle Opera, so you'll be able to hear what he's talking about. So this is Mark in his own home in Greenwich Village talking to you about what inspires him.
Lots of research. I looked everywhere, starting, of course, with the Walter Isaacson book, and I began to see what Mason saw in this subject. I think I had a sort of eureka moment, an aha moment, when I discovered that Steve Jobs had practiced Soto Zen Buddhism his entire life. For me, this humanized him, and that led me into like a rather superficial discovery of Zen Buddhism. I had a libretto to write, and that led me to the discovery of the enso.
And so the calligraphic circular symbol Buddhist monks draw in 1 or 2 strokes, usually 1. Since no one can draw a perfect circle, the enso celebrates human imperfection. And Mason Bates paints this by writing a flute motive that on the page looks a little bit like a circle or a wave motive that you'll hear when this idea comes out in the opera.
These machines could be something we play.
The enso also provided me with a way to look at a different kind of structure for this story. I know I didn't want to do like a straight chronological narrative, sort of like a Lifetime Movie of the Week version of this story. I thought the subject deserved something a little bit more revolutionary than that. And actually, revolutionary is a good word because the title, The Revolution of Steve Jobs, doesn't just refer to the revolution he helped create in technology, but the revolution the story takes. It takes place in a circle. It starts with Steve Jobs as a 10-year-old boy at a work table that his father brought him for his birthday, and the story goes around in a circle and returns there. He looks at his collaboration over the years with Steve Wozniak, or Woz, starting as 2 California stoner boys in a garage. smoking some good weed, and just kind of riffing and coming up with ideas that would eventually lead to the democratization of the personal computer.
That's one for the common people, that's one for Abby Hoffman, that's one for Cesar Chavez, that's one for the troublemakers, rebels, and sinners who keep this planet spinning. For Dylan, for Bob Dylan, Dylan Thomas, Bob and Thomas, rebels, freaks, reformers who keep this planet spinning.
That relationship, of course, with Woz dissolved as Steve became more corporate, and also his ego started taking over his relationship with his work. Steve also examines, in a way, his relationship with his girlfriend, Chris Ann. There's a scene where he does acid, and he imagines he hears music, and that later leads to his vision of the personal computer. And it also, years later, looks at how that relationship dissolved and how Steve Jobs refused to accept fatherhood initially for the daughter they created.
And you may never know what you want in life, but your mind keeps working, searching, percolating, clicking away. I could learn to like you, like a lot.
Okay. There's one major character that I haven't let you hear. Just to remind you sort of who the main characters are in the opera. You have Steve and Woz, the friends, known each other since high school. Chris Ann, who is also a high school friend that would be involved in the early development of the company. Then you have Laureen Powell, Jobs' later wife. Also in the opera is a baritone character, Paul Jobs, Steve's father. You'll see him especially in the first and the last scene, framing the narrative. And last but very much not least, as a spirit guide, Kobuchino Otogawa. And the background here is meant to evoke sort of the Santa Cruz Mountains, the hills behind Carmel, where still today is the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, the main place to go in the United States to study Zen Buddhism. So here's a little bit of the interaction of Kobuchino as a spirit guide. The date of 2003 is the year in which Steve Jobs was first diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and was coming to terms with his own mortality. It wasn't announced for a while, wasn't known yet to the public at this point. But here the librettist has him conversing with Kobuchino, his former spiritual mentor. And we'll hear just a little bit of their conversation. Gongs and flutes. Very quiet.
And you resent the diminishment deeply. What was it I said in that speech years ago? I don't know. You said so many foolish things. You can't connect the dots going forward. You can only connect them going backward. Pretty good. Must have gotten that from me. Quite a sky, the sky of my youth. Quite a sun, oh always loveliest when it's leaving me and basically a circle. A circle.
Okay, and you see the enso there. All right, now I mentioned early productions of this. This is an opera that was co-commissioned. So the original plan was Santa Fe would premiere it in 2017, Indiana in 2018, Seattle in 2019, and we in San Francisco in 2020. But COVID intervened, and it was fortunately not canceled, but postponed to 2023. All those, the first three and the last, use the production design you see on the left with the black background and the moving doors or monoliths. In this case, they're decorated like iPhones. The picture you see below is a new second production design that's been seen at Austin and Atlanta and Kansas City and will be seen in Calgary. And that's a very different kind of brighter production design with influence from surrealism and Dada and pop art. And so it's a very contrasting way of visualizing the same narrative, the same music, and similar but slightly different costuming. So I wanted to conclude by letting you hear one of the really great arias. This is for the baritone voice, and this is the character of Steve Jobs, and he is singing about developing the concept of instruments are something we play, and maybe these devices that he's thinking of, the future of personal computing, could also be something we play. Okay, and we need to go way over. Let me move my ruler out of the way, excuse me. And this is the voice of John Moore, who will be singing. He was singing in Austin, he sang in Seattle, and he will be our San Francisco Steve Jobs.
Something we play, something we bang, he blow, something we trill, hum strong, something we
So that's something to look forward to. Then that concludes my presentation, and I'd like to throw it back to have a little bit of a Q&A to John Morris. If you have comments or questions, either for me on musical issues or technical questions that an Apple employee might be able to answer who worked there in the heyday of his return, the late 1990s, please write your comments in the Q&A. And I think my husband, who worked at Apple, is here as well to assist me with technical matters. So I'm going to stop sharing. I thank you very much and hope you enjoy either seeing it live or streaming it, maybe on an Apple device, next Wednesday.
Thank you so much, Laura, for this insightful presentation. And I know I learned a lot, and we are going to dive right into the Q&A. I'm going to start with one question we have here, but before I do that, we want to invite our attendees to join us here on the virtual stage. And so I'm going to send you individual invitations to join us as panelists, so you can turn on your camera and unmute to ask Laura a question if you have it. We also would love to know where you're zooming in from and if you have a favorite Apple product. So if you could put that in the Q&A by clicking the Q&A button, that would be great. Our first question, Laura, is I was wondering if this opera includes electronic sounds to accompany the singers, and are modern current operas embracing the most recent trends or staying more traditional? And also, there was another question about the voices being amplified or not in this opera.
Yes, they are being amplified. In earlier productions of this production design, you could see very clearly on, for example, the forehead of Laureen's character, his wife, microphones. So it's like small pickup microphones that Broadway singers sometimes hide in their hair now. And the reason for that is, yes, there are electronic sounds that are part of this. And it is not a typical classical aria and opera, sorry, a typical classical opera in the sense that it is purely an acoustic orchestra with acoustic voices singing over it. There is an element of sound design and of balance and use of electronics. But the reason for that is twofold. One is that Mason Bates himself is a DJ and has written several pieces for orchestras where he's on stage with the headphones doing live sound manipulation. So he can add in electronics and he can balance the sound because every orchestra is different in every room. And this is a production that's been first outside at San Francisco Opera, then in a smaller hall at Indiana, and now similar size spaces in San Francisco and Seattle. So it's a very flexible piece for that. They are not embracing things like auto-tune or processing of the voices. You will hear the natural voices. And if you sit up close, you'll probably hear their acoustic voice louder than the microphones would pick it up anyway. These are classically trained voices. And especially John Moore singing Steve Jobs and Sasha Cook singing Laureen Powell have established careers singing acoustically over orchestras very, very well. So it's just a matter of balance and subtlety, not a matter of blasting you out of your seats.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have received some responses. So we have folks joining us from Alameda and Mountain View, California, Marin, San Francisco, and some favorite products include the iMac, iPhone. Let's see here, MacBook Air, another iPhone, and another iPhone, and iPod as well. And welcome, Eve and Michael, to our virtual stage. Did you have a question for Laura?
I'm going to show my favorite, the iBook. Lots of round things, round circles, round doors, round buttons.
Did you have a question for Laura, Michael, or Eve?
No, just participating.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us on the virtual stage here. I will just add that
everyone was going to do that.
Yes, invitations were sent, so feel free to join us. I have to say the iPhone, and then I'm currently on a MacBook Air myself, which I rely on daily. So thank you to Steve Jobs and others. Another question. Yeah.
There's one question in the Q&A. It says he found out in 2003 he had pancreatic cancer. What is the date when he's visiting his spiritual teacher, say 1973. So in 1973, that's the date from the sort of early moments of creation. For example, the scene with the Ma Bell song. But in the visual design, there's a little bit of blurring of the scenes. They're not in chronological order. So sometimes you'll still see visual images relating to the previous scene when you're fading into a future conversation. Or he'll be in conversation with his spirit guide, and then he will remember an earlier scene. So sometimes there's a little bit of disjunction in the dates. On the San Francisco Opera website and in the printed program that you'll get live, there is now a list of all the scenes with the correct dates of all of the happenings. So for example, you get to see a little bit of his wedding at the Alwani Hotel in Yosemite Valley, and where the cake was half dome, and he wore jeans. And you get to see moments, intimate moments with both his wife, Lorraine Powell, and with his high school girlfriend, Cassandra Brennan. And yeah, there's a little bit of blurring of the timeline there. There's one question on here I think maybe Mike Prichard would be better to answer. Did the Enso circle influence his view of design? Clean, simple. Mike had to sit in on a lot of meetings where product designers were saying things like, do this, but make it round. So I wonder, Mike, if you'd say just a few words about his view of design or how it impacted you as actually an Apple employee.
I actually didn't know anything about the Enso circle per se, but as far as his obsession with simple cleanliness, it started way back to probably after the Apple II, but the original Macintosh. We all are familiar with, I think most of us who are Mac users, with the mouse that has only one button. And that was something that Steve actually, that was his one innovation, that the mouse that he was witness to originally at Xerox PARC was, I think it had 3 buttons on it. And that's sort of what the scientists at Xerox PARC were coming up with, wacky technology ideas had come up with. And he was convinced that something like that, something as revolutionary as a new input device like a mouse, needed to be very simple. And a single button was a crucial aspect of that, even though the technologists at the time didn't know how they would possibly get all the functions that they were now using with 3 buttons. And that just kept on going throughout his entire career. The iPhone is a great example. I think, I don't know if I guess you didn't play that clip. I missed the beginning, but I didn't see the clip about
my paper one.
Yeah. And he was famous in his speech when he's introducing that phone of showing the smartphones of the day, the Blackberries, the handsprings, the Palms, that had QWERTY keyboards taking up half the display or half the front of the face of the unit. And the kids today won't even recognize those things, but it was thought that you had to have physical buttons in order to have something that you could type on, and he really pushed and I think are largely conceived of and came up with that the single the 0 button phone.
Some of what you're saying shows up in the arias in the opera too. Parts of the keynotes and him making circles in the air with his hand and talking about simplicity and purity of design, getting rid of unneeded corners, that kind of thing.
We had another comment come in. I think Jobs had a heightened aesthetic sense, unusual in the engineering world, which is an interesting comment. I wanted to just ask you, Laura, thank you so much, Michael. I wanted to ask you, Laura, a question that came up for me. When you played the inspiration theme, it sounded very Western to me.
Yeah.
And my sense of that is that because, Steve Jobs lived and worked in the West and, in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, it sounded very Western to me. And I was hoping you could comment on that. And also, some of the singing, while some of it does sound quite operatic, some of it sounds more like almost a musical. And so, if you could just comment on those 2 things, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the more youthful and immature the characters are, the more the music given to them sounds like pop music.
Mm-hmm.
So when the characters are supposed to be college age, they have something that's kind of swinging, little blues oriented. And then when the characters are in more mature adult situations, like wife coming in and speaking to husband and saying, please stop working. And the husband saying, I'm in the middle of something and then I will return to real life. That comes across as a much more kind of Verdian classical way of using, especially the string orchestra. The other thing you said about the inspiration kind of music, the composer, Mason Bates, is born in the East and educated in New York and then comes west. So there are a lot of composers that happens to. There are a lot of sort of American stories. For example, the Berkeley-based composer John Adams is educated at Harvard and then gets in his car and drives across the country and becomes a Berkeley resident, Berkeley composer. And Mason Bates has never said anything about specifically getting the ideas for that from somewhere, but I wrote my dissertation on Copland, so to a certain extent, everything sounds like Copland to me. Everything reminds me of Copland, even if it came before Copland. So to me, it sounds a little bit like Billy the Kid, like Rodeo, that kind of motoric, open fourth stacks, string instrument tuning, informed music that he wrote in the sort of period where he was writing nationalistic works right before and during World War II. And Copland was trying to create a Western sound. He was copying a lot of that from Virgil Thompson, who was a New York critic. So it's really kind of a New Yorker's conception of the sound of the open West. And I think that's relevant to Mason Bates and that's relevant to John Adams. And it's certainly where Copland and Virgil Thompson were coming from. It's not like any of them had gone out and hung around with cowboys and done field work, but they had a sense of the fiddle being an important instrument. And if you play the open strings, you get that stack of open intervals. And then the motoric sounds of, for John Adams, it's the sound of his car as he drives across on the road trip to get to Berkeley, or the sounds of trains. I think it's really a great reference that you made, and it allows for a lot of electronica and other sounds into a texture that if you use just band instruments would be Copland, but it really stretches the conception. It just requires a lot of technology to balance those extra electronic sounds with the live orchestra.
Thank you.
Sure.
Joan commented that she loves that Apple products have color and are colorful. And Helen asked the kind of music that Steve Jobs liked, which is an interesting question.
Kind of music that Steve Jobs liked. So he prided himself in being really interested in humanities. And so when he talks about music, very often he talks about Bob Dylan, and he talks more about the lyrics than the sound of Bob Dylan's voice, like being inspired by lyrics of popular music in the 60s and 70s. I'm not sure I know that information. I don't think there was a lot of music at his wedding. And Mike Prichard, was there a lot of music during keynotes? Like when he's presenting the music, is there usually, or when he's presenting products, there wasn't usually music in the background, right? There was
no, the music was a big deal. All the company,
like, all I remember is dun da da da, and he comes out.
No, the company events, they were always very curated as far as the music you'd hear, but it was very, not classic rock, but sort of Steely Dan kind of art, jazz influence, very popular. I mean, that kind of bluesy sound. Acoustic, usually a lot of acoustic guitar would be playing, but frequently something that you recognize.
Okay. Well, after each live performance at San Francisco, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, they're going to be doing an after party downstairs, and the theme of the after party is 1980. So that would make sense if it's exactly that kind of music that you're describing, sort of art rock, little bit sophisticated harmonies on a mix of acoustic and electric instruments. Yeah, that's interesting. Now I have to go and I have to read The Bite and the Apple and see if Chris Ann Brennan talks about what music they all listened to in high school. It'd be interesting.
Another question from Andrea. I understand that the role of Laureen has been increased. Are there any scenes that are new since the Santa Fe premiere? Any changes?
I don't know of new scenes, but some of the scenes have incorporated more singing for her where there were instrumental pauses between the conversation. So there's a little bit of new text that's been created for her to bring her character to life and get more of a sense of her as a person, because she's gone on to be a very important philanthropist and someone that's very carefully curated the massive amount of wealth that's been created by this company and find ways to pour that money back into education and back into innovation. So it gives a little bit more depth to her as an artist and as a person who is involved with the company as well, not just a personal acquaintance because, but a business partner as well.
Thank you. Another question regarding the two different set designs and the two different productions, and just to learn a little bit more about that, and if you anticipate, if that kind of second production will have legs, or if, the original set design will be the one that will be continued, or your thoughts.
Yeah, the original set design, this is the fourth time it's being seen. So the commissioning organizations. And then you can, if you want to mount this production, you can pay a performance fee, just like you would if you wanted to do a Broadway musical, and that will get you the score materials. And then you can decide if you would like to borrow one of their productions, either borrow the ideas of it or actually have them ship it to you in shipping containers. And you can hire it, basically. Or you could just pay the performance fee. Then you could create a new visual, piece of your own. Depends on your space. So they are not sort of twinned in the sense that if you pay for the performance rights, you're getting a certain visual package with it. You have to choose and apply to use the set pieces and use the costumes. So right now they both kind of have legs because the one that is not being presented in San Francisco this year is being seen in Calgary and a couple of other places. And I believe this production will also travel.
Wonderful. We do have one more question from Helen. I'm not sure what you mean by using amplification for balance. What are we balancing?
Okay, so if you have no microphones in the orchestra, then you can choose to mic a singer or not, just to make them louder, because they're getting swamped by the non-mic'd acoustic orchestra. As soon as you add electronic elements, the sound of those elements, like computer-generated sounds or an electric guitar that would be basically silent if it weren't plugged into an amp, those sounds will be coming out of some speakers somewhere, and you can either set the speaker down in the orchestra and just treat it like a cello and try to have one person manipulating that versus the whole orchestra, or you can put mics loosely throughout the orchestra very carefully, and you can put mics on the singers, and then you have the ability to turn them off completely or to, in real time, bring people up and down to balance. For example, there are some parts that the spirit guide is speaking, and there are very few instruments playing, and the amplification of the singer's voices is pretty much turned off completely, and it gives you a very sort of empty, haunting quality, and the sound isn't reinforced at all. And then when you have the whole orchestra playing, and you have a little bit of the computer sounds for the kind of inspiration music, and people are singing over that, then you have people, you have the ability to pull people up and down and make sure that the voice is always prominent, even with those extra electronic effects. So sometimes all of the controls are basically down and off, and sometimes they're on all different levels, and it just depends on the room. People are listening both with headphones on, and they're listening acoustically to the sound. But really the most exciting thing about it is that unlike most of these YouTube videos, there will be surtitles in English. So at all times, a very clear sense of exactly what's being said, even if a word is staying for a very long time. You can always follow the narrative. It won't be as crisp as that Grammy-winning recording, because every single person is singing on mic there, and that's been balanced by expert engineers. But it will be easily audible. It's very beautifully sung, and almost everybody performing it has done it before. John Moore, Steve Jobs did it in Seattle and Utah and Austin and Atlanta, for example. Sasha Cook singing Loreen and Wei Wu singing Kobun, both were in that Grammy-winning recording. So you get a lot of experience brought to this with the characters already for such a new work.
Thank you. Angela also mentioned here a comment. I heard Mason Bates will be in the orchestra pit.
If he's in the orchestra pit, he will have headphones on and he will be working things, turning things on and off and adjusting things, which is great. Verdi used to sit out in the audience and think, oh, wish I were more in charge, and get up and yell at people to be quiet. And, you know, sometimes go and hide in the second violin section and then get up and go and yell at people to be quiet and come back. And if they threw flowers on the stage, he would get up and throw them back in the audience and tell them to be quiet. So to have the composer part of the noise and the sound and participating is really awesome. A lot of fun.
Wonderful. That's a great visual of Verdi taking that on. So thank you to our attendees for your questions and comments, and thank you, Michael, for joining us and for your insights. I'm going to turn it over to Peggy now. I am just going to mention that this wonderful virtual preview is being recorded and is available to stream on demand through the run of the production, which is October 7th.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Laura. The insight that we now have into this opera will certainly make it so much more enjoyable to all of us. Really appreciate it. And this isn't goodbye, because we're going to see Laura again, and she's going to be our preview speaker for Omar. She'll be the virtual preview will be on, I think it's November 3rd at 6 p.m. So we'll see you then. Plus, you'll be at all of the Bay Areas doing the live in-person previews, and that's all on the San Francisco Opera Previews website, so just check it out. Our next preview, though, we will see you on October 13th, Friday at 6 p.m. Simon Williams, a retired professor from UC Santa Barbara, will discuss Wagner's Lohengrin. And I thought you'd like to know a little bit about what the education department is doing over at San Francisco Opera Guild. The education staff and professional singers right now are busy rehearsing The Elixir of Love, and it's going to be presented in Bay Area schools throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. And the Opera Together productions always include, which is wonderful, students. Students participate in this, and usually the opera is shown to the entire student body. Well, anyway, we're looking forward to seeing all of you at the opera. Thank you for joining us tonight. All of us on the previous committee, thank you very much for joining us. Have a lovely evening and see you at the opera. Bye-bye.